My hands would not stop shaking, and I hated that. I stood at the far end of the great hall on Aurella's station, pressed between two taller delegates from a species whose names I could not pronounce, and I watched Princess Leora Vex walk down the long silver aisle toward the row of humans she was supposed to choose from. Every step she took echoed through the chamber like a countdown. I told myself she would not look at me. There was no reason for her to look at me. I was nobody, a maintenance technician with a translator badge, standing in a line of decorated soldiers, sharp diplomats, and scientists whose names appeared in journals I had never read. She stopped in front of me. The whole hall went quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your ears. I could feel every human behind me lean forward, confused, waiting for her to move past me the way logic said she should. Leora tilted her head, her pale violet eyes studying my face the way someone studies a locked door, searching for a seam. "You," she said, in careful, accented English. "What is your name?" "Ethan," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Ethan Bell." "Ethan Bell," she repeated, as if testing the shape of it in her mouth. "You will be my liaison." A murmur rolled through the hall like wind through tall grass. Colonel Grace Whitfield, our station commander, stepped forward with a look on her face that was somewhere between confusion and alarm. "Your Highness," Grace said carefully, "there may be more suitable candidates. Ethan is a technician. He has no diplomatic training." Leora did not look away from me when she answered. "I did not ask for training. I asked for him." I did not know why she chose me. I still do not fully understand it, even now, looking back at that moment from wherever this story ends, but I remember the way her eyes moved over me, not like a woman looking at a stranger, but like someone who already suspected a secret and wanted to watch my face while she searched for it. I was supposed to be the least interesting person in that room. That was the whole point. That was the life I had built for myself, brick by brick, for 6 years. Ordinary, forgettable, safe. The Kalan Dominion, Leora's empire, was not a small power. They controlled trade lanes across a third of the known galaxy, and their ships alone could have erased our little station from the sky without much effort. Humanity, by comparison, was a footnote. A species other civilizations mentioned the way you might mention a new species of insect you found in your garden. Curious, maybe. Never a threat, never anything worth close inspection. That reputation had not happened by accident. I knew that better than almost anyone alive, but I was not going to think about that in the middle of a crowded hall with an alien princess staring at me like I was a puzzle she intended to solve. After the ceremony, Sarah Neath, the princess's chief advisor, pulled me aside into a smaller room off the main hall. She was tall, with skin the color of polished stone and eyes that missed nothing. "You should feel honored," Sarah said, though her tone suggested she did not feel particularly pleased about the choice. "The princess rarely selects on instinct. She has reasons for everything she does, even when those reasons are not obvious to the rest of us. I don't understand why she picked me," I said, and that part at least was true. Sarah studied me for a long moment. "Neither do I. That is what concerns me. I spent that first night lying awake in my small quarters, staring at the ceiling, running through every possible explanation. Maybe it was random. Maybe she wanted to make a point about equality between species, choosing the least impressive human to prove something to her court. Maybe it was nothing more than curiosity, the kind you feel when you see something ordinary sitting in a place it does not belong. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I would do my duty, keep my head down, and get through the diplomatic exchange without drawing attention. That had been my plan since the day I arrived at this station. Blend in, stay quiet, let the file with my name on it stay buried under 6 years of dust. The next morning, I reported to the guest wing where the Kalan delegation was staying, and a guard escorted me to a garden room built inside a section of the station reserved for visiting dignitaries. Real plants grew there, brought from a dozen different worlds, their colors strange and beautiful under the artificial light. Leora sat on a stone bench, watching a small stream of water move through a channel carved into the floor. "You came," she said, without turning around. "You asked for me," I said. "I don't have much of a choice." That earned the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth. "Everyone has a choice, Ethan Bell. Some people simply choose to hide it." I did not answer that. I sat down on the bench across from her, keeping a respectful distance, and waited for her to explain what she wanted from me. Instead, she asked me questions. Simple ones at first. Where I grew up, what my work involved, whether I had a family waiting for me somewhere. I gave her the answers I had given 100 times before, the ones that fit neatly into the ordinary life I had built. But her questions kept circling back, again and again, to the years before I arrived at this station. What had I done before this posting? Why had I transferred here from a base with an unusual name and no public records? Why did my file list a gap of nearly 2 years with no explanation at all? "Redacted records are common in human service," I said, keeping my voice light. "Bureaucracy. Nothing interesting." "I have read many human files," Leora said. "Redactions are common, yes, but most redactions explain themselves, even in their silence. Yours does not explain anything, it simply stops, like a door closing." I felt something cold settle in my chest, but I kept my face calm. 6 years of practice had taught me how to do that, at least. "I'm not that complicated, Your Highness, I promise." She looked at me for a long moment, and something behind her eyes told me she did not believe a single word of it. But she let the subject drop, at least for that day, and instead asked me to walk with her through the garden while she pointed out plants from her homeworld and told me small stories about her childhood. I found myself relaxing, despite my better judgment. She was sharp, funny, in a dry way I had not expected from royalty, and she asked about human customs with genuine curiosity, instead of the polite boredom I had seen from other visiting dignitaries. By the end of that first week, I had convinced myself I was managing the situation well. I answered her questions carefully. I avoided situations where my instincts might slip through the mask I had built. I laughed at the right moments, and stayed quiet at the right moments, and made myself as unremarkable as possible, which had always been the safest way to live. Then came the incident in the transport corridor. I was walking Leora back to her quarters after a diplomatic dinner when one of the station's old cargo lifts failed above us, sending a heavy support beam crashing down from a maintenance gap in the ceiling. I did not think. There was no time to think. My body moved on its own, the way it had been trained to move long before I ever set foot on this station, and I pulled her out of the beam's path a full second before it would have crushed us both. The corridor went silent, except for the echo of metal hitting the floor. Leora stared up at me, her hand still gripping my arm where I had pulled her, and I realized, too late, exactly what I had just shown her. A man who worked in station maintenance should not move that fast. He should not calculate a falling object's trajectory in less than a heartbeat. He should not have hands steady enough, afterward, to help her stand without a single tremor, when everyone around us was shaking with shock. "You saved my life," she said quietly. "Anyone would have done the same," I said, already backing toward the excuse, already feeling the old familiar instinct to disappear before anyone asked too many questions. "No," Leora said, and there was something new in her voice now, something sharper than curiosity. "Not anyone could have done what you just did." I excused myself as quickly as I could without being rude, citing the need to report the accident to station engineering, and I walked away from her with my heart pounding harder than it had during the fall itself. Because I understood, in that moment, that the careful wall I had built around myself had just cracked, and standing on the other side of that crack was a woman clever enough, and now curious enough, to start pulling the whole thing down. I did not know it yet, but Leora Vex had already begun looking into records that no ordinary diplomat should have been able to access. She had already sent a quiet message to her intelligence officers, asking them to find out everything they could about a human maintenance technician named Ethan Bell, and about a 2-year gap in his file that closed like a door with nothing written on either side. I went back to my quarters that night and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about the life I had left behind, the uniform I had folded away and never worn again, and the promise I had made to myself the day I walked off that final transport ship. I had promised myself I would never again be the kind of man who had to move that fast, who had to calculate falling beams in half a second, who had to carry the weight of what I used to be. I did not know then how quickly that promise was about to fall apart, or how much the woman sleeping 2 corridors away from me was about to change the rest of my life. Around midnight, my door chimed. I opened it to find Daniel Ford standing there, still in his work uniform, holding 2 cups of coffee he had clearly stolen from the officers' mess. "Word is spreading fast," Daniel said, pushing past me into the room without waiting for an invitation. He had been my closest friend since my first week on this station, one of the only people who never asked too many questions about my past, mostly because he was too busy talking about his own life to notice the gaps in mine. "They're saying you moved like something out of a training video. Caught a falling beam like it was a beach ball." "I got lucky," I said, taking the coffee he offered. Daniel gave me a long look, the kind that told me he did not quite believe me, but had decided not to push. "You've always been fast, Ethan. Faster than you let people see. I figured it was just good reflexes, but the way people are talking tonight, it sounds like something else." "It's nothing," I said, and I hated how easily the lie came out, even to my closest friend. He did not argue. He never did. He simply sat down at my small table, sipped his coffee, and changed the subject to something about the station's failing water recycler, and I let myself be grateful for the distraction. But long after he left, I sat by the window that looked out over the black curve of space, and I thought about the look on Leora's face in that corridor. Not fear, not suspicion, not exactly. Something closer to recognition, as if she had seen a flicker of something she had been searching for without knowing its name. Whatever she had seen in me that night, I knew it would not stay buried for long, and for the first time in 6 years, I found myself wondering if I even wanted it to. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm I told myself I could manage. Every morning, I reported to the guest wing to escort Leora through her scheduled duties, translating for lower-ranking officials, standing beside her during trade negotiations I barely understood, and attending court functions where I felt like a stray dog that had wandered into a formal dinner. Her retinue did not make it easy. Ren Dax, her guard captain, treated me with a cold politeness that made it clear he considered me a decoration rather than a colleague. Lord Draven Kesh, a distant cousin of Leora's who had arrived on the station only days after the selection ceremony, treated me with something far worse than coldness. Draven was tall, elegant, and carried himself like a man who had never once been told no. He wore his ambition the way other people wore cologne, impossible to ignore once you were close enough to notice it. From our very first meeting, he made no effort to hide his opinion of me. "A maintenance worker," he said at a formal dinner during my second week, loud enough for half the table to hear. How refreshing. I suppose the Dominion's reputation for excellence must allow for a bit of charity now and then. Laughter rippled around the table, polite and careful, the kind that comes from people who are more afraid of the man making the joke than amused by it. I kept my expression neutral and said nothing, because I had learned long ago that silence was safer than pride. Leora, seated beside me, did not laugh. She watched Draven with an expression that could have frozen the wine in every glass on that table. "Cousin," she said, her voice pleasant on the surface and sharp underneath. I did not realize charity required saving my life in a collapsing corridor. Perhaps you would care to demonstrate your own reflexes sometime, so we might compare. Draven's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes went very still. He said nothing further that night, but I felt his attention on me for the rest of the dinner, weighing, calculating, the way a man measures an obstacle before deciding how to remove it. Later, walking back through the quiet corridor toward her quarters, Leora glanced sideways at me. "You did not defend yourself." "It wasn't worth the trouble," I said. "People like your cousin enjoy a reaction. Denying him one is usually the better strategy." "That is a very careful way to live," she said. "It's kept me alive this long." She stopped walking and turned to face me fully, her violet eyes searching my face again, in that way that always made me feel like a locked door someone was slowly picking apart. "It kept you alive from what, Ethan Bell? You speak as if danger has been a regular companion in your ordinary life as a station technician." I forced a small, tired smile. "Everyone has a story or two. Mine just aren't very interesting." "I am beginning to suspect the opposite," she said quietly, and walked on without waiting for my response. I told myself, that night and many nights after, that I simply needed to be more careful, less noticeable. I practiced keeping my movements slower than they wanted to be, my reactions half a second behind what my training demanded, forcing myself back into the shape of an ordinary man. It worked, for a while, in small ways. I let myself flinch at things I did not need to flinch at. I let my hands shake slightly when I picked up dishes, the way tired, unremarkable men's hands sometimes shake. I became, on the surface, exactly the kind of harmless companion the court expected a human liaison to be. But masks are hardest to hold in the moments you do not expect to need them. It happened on a quiet afternoon, nearly a month into my assignment, during a private garden walk with Leora and two of her younger attendants. We were nowhere near the crowded halls of court, no audience to perform for, which was probably why I let my guard drop just enough. One of the attendants, a young woman named Mira, was showing Leora a small mechanical bird she had built as a hobby, its metal wings folding and unfolding with delicate, careful clicks. The bird's small power cell, I noticed immediately, was leaking, not obviously. Not in any way that Mira or Leora would have seen, but I had spent 2 years of my life learning to notice the smallest signs of danger before they became disasters, and the faint metallic smell rising from that little machine told me exactly what was about to happen, 3 full seconds before it happened. I crossed the space between us faster than any ordinary man should have been able to move, closed my hand around the bird, and threw it into the garden's small reflecting pool just as it sparked and hissed, releasing a short burst of heat and smoke that the water swallowed harmlessly. The garden went silent. Mira stared at her ruined project with wide, startled eyes. Leora stared at me. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice low. "Lucky guess," I said, already stepping back, already feeling the familiar cold panic of having revealed too much. The smell of overheating metal. Anyone who's worked in maintenance would recognize it. "No one recognizes it 3 seconds before it happens," Leora said. "No one moves like that for a mechanical toy, Ethan." I did not have an answer for her, not one that would hold up under the weight of her attention, so I excused myself again, the way I always did, retreating before the questions could pile any higher. I told myself I was protecting her, protecting myself, protecting the fragile peace I had built out of 6 years of careful silence. But walking away from her that day felt different than it had before. It felt like running. That night, Leora did something she had not done before. She came to my quarters herself, without an escort, without warning, and stood in my doorway with her arms crossed and an expression that told me she was done accepting careful non-answers. "I want the truth," she said. "I've told you the truth," I said, though we both knew it was not. "You have told me pieces of a story that do not fit together," she said. "You move like a soldier trained for war. You notice danger before it exists. You have a gap in your record that no bureaucracy in the galaxy leaves unexplained unless someone wanted it unexplained on purpose. I am not a fool, Ethan Bell, and I am tired of being treated like one. I stood there in the doorway of my own quarters, caught between 6 years of discipline and the sudden, overwhelming urge to simply tell her everything. It would have been so easy, in that moment, to open the door the rest of the way and let her see what was on the other side. But I had made promises, not to myself alone, but to people who no longer had the chance to keep their own promises, people whose names I still carried quietly, whose sacrifice had bought the peaceful, boring life I was now failing to protect. "I can't," I said finally. "Not because I don't trust you, because it isn't only my secret to give away." Something in her expression shifted, softened slightly, though the sharpness never fully left her eyes. "Then, at least tell me this. Whatever you were before you came here, whatever you are hiding beneath that careful, quiet mask you wear so well, does it make you dangerous to me?" "No," I said, and for the first time in that entire conversation, my voice did not waver at all. "It has only ever made me dangerous to the things that would hurt you." She studied me for a long moment, weighing that answer the way she seemed to weigh everything, carefully and without haste. Finally, she nodded once, stepped back from my door, and said nothing further before walking away down the quiet corridor. I closed my door and stood with my back against it for a long time, my heart pounding in a way it had not pounded in years, not from fear of danger, but from the strange, terrifying relief of having told someone, even partially, the truth. I did not know it then, but that small admission, that single honest sentence, would matter more than almost anything else I said to her in the weeks that followed, because less than 3 days later, the peace of Arelis Station shattered completely, and the mask I had spent 6 years building would not survive what came next. 2 nights before Draven's departure, there was a formal reception in the station's largest hall, meant to celebrate the halfway point of the diplomatic exchange. I stood near the edge of the room, as I always did, watching Leora move gracefully between conversations, offering polite responses to officials who clearly wanted more of her attention than she was willing to give them. Daniel found me there, balancing 2 plates of food he had clearly claimed for both of us without asking. "You look like a man standing guard," Daniel said, handing me a plate, "not a man attending a party." "Old habits," I said, echoing the excuse I had given so many people already. Daniel studied the room for a moment, then lowered his voice. "People are talking, you know, about the corridor, about the mechanical bird in the garden. Nobody believes the lucky guest story anymore, Ethan. Not really. They're just polite enough not to say it to your face." "Let them talk," I said. "Talk isn't proof of anything." "Maybe not," Daniel said, "but I've known you for years, and I've never once seen your hands shake from nerves the way they did that first night I brought you coffee. I think whatever you're carrying, it's heavier than you're letting anyone believe, including me." I did not answer that, because there was nothing safe to say, and Daniel, being the kind of friend he was, did not push further. He simply stayed beside me for the rest of the reception, filling the silence with easy conversation about nothing important, giving me the space to breathe without demanding explanations I was not yet ready to give. Later that evening, Draven approached me directly, for the first time since the dinner where he had mocked me in front of the table. He found me alone near the edge of the room, his expression carrying none of its usual practiced charm. "You intrigue me," he said quietly, studying my face the way a merchant studies goods he suspects are worth more than their listed price. A common technician who moves fast enough to save a princess from a falling beam. Who is calm enough to remain unruffled at a table full of nobility, mocking him openly. "I do not believe in coincidence, Ethan Bell. I believe in patterns, and you do not fit the pattern of the man your file claims you to be." "People are more complicated than files," I said carefully. "Perhaps," Draven said, "or perhaps some files are written specifically to hide complications from people like me." He studied me a moment longer, then offered a thin, humorless smile. "I will discover your secret eventually. I discover everyone's secrets eventually. I only hope, for your sake, that whatever you are hiding does not become inconvenient for my cousin's future." He walked away before I could answer, and I stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of his threat settle over me the way cold water settles into your bones. I did not know yet exactly what Draven intended, only that his curiosity about me had shifted into something closer to calculation, and calculation from a man like him rarely led anywhere safe. Lord Draven left the station abruptly the following morning, offering only a vague excuse about urgent business within the Dominion. I did not think much of it at the time. I should have, because Draven did not leave to attend to business. He left to set something in motion, something designed to remove Leora from the succession entirely, and to make certain that whatever secret I was hiding would either destroy me or be buried along with the rest of us in the wreckage of Arella's station. The alarms tore through Arella's station at 3 in the morning, and I was awake and moving before the first note finished sounding. Old instincts do not sleep, even after 6 years of trying to bury them. I was dressed and in the corridor within 20 seconds, my mind already running through every emergency protocol I had ever memorized, human and otherwise. Red emergency lighting bathed the halls in a dull crimson glow, and station personnel ran past me in every direction, most of them heading toward the evacuation shelters rather than toward the danger, which told me immediately that this was not a drill. Hull breach on decks 4 and 6, a voice crackled over the station comm. Unidentified vessels have disabled our outer defense grid. All personnel, proceed to designated shelters immediately. Unidentified vessels did not disable a station's defense grid by accident. Someone had planned this, and planned it well, which meant someone had known exactly where the grid's weaknesses were. My mind went immediately to Draven, to his sudden departure 3 days earlier, to the calculating look he had given me at that dinner table. I did not have proof yet, but I did not need proof to know where my feet needed to take me first. Leora's quarters were 2 decks up, in the section of the station reserved for the Kalan delegation, and that section was directly beneath the reported hull breach. I ran. I did not walk, did not jog carefully while pretending to be an ordinary frightened technician caught in an emergency. I ran the way I had been trained to run, the way my body still remembered how to move even after years of forcing it to forget, covering the distance between my quarters and hers in a fraction of the time it should have taken. Smoke thickened in the corridors near the breach point, and twice I had to pull frightened station workers out of the path of falling debris, moving them to safety before continuing on without slowing down enough to explain myself. I found Rendax first, standing guard outside Leora's door with his weapon drawn, blood running from a cut above his eye where debris had struck him. "Where is she?" I demanded. "Inside," Ren said, his voice tight with pain and urgency. "The breach team is already moving through the lower corridors. If they reach this deck—" He did not need to finish the sentence. I pushed past him into the room and found Leora already awake, already dressed, calmly strapping a small emergency beacon to her wrist, with hands that did not shake, though her face was pale in the dim emergency light. "You should be in the evacuation shelter," she said, glancing up at me. "So should you," I said. "That's not happening for either of us right now. Whoever did this, they targeted your section specifically. This wasn't random." Her eyes sharpened with understanding, the same quick intelligence I had come to expect from her, and I watched the pieces click into place behind her expression at nearly the same speed they had clicked into place in my own mind. "Draven," she said quietly. "We don't have time to be certain," I said. "We need to move you somewhere they don't expect." Before she could answer, the wall beside her door buckled inward with a shriek of tearing metal, and 3 armed figures dropped through the gap, their weapons already raised. I recognized their armor immediately. Mercenary gear stripped of any identifying marks, the kind of equipment bought quietly through channels that did not ask questions about intent. Ren fired first, dropping one of them before they fully cleared the breach, but the other 2 turned their weapons toward Leora with the cold efficiency of professionals who had been paid enough not to hesitate. I did not think. There was no room left for thinking, only for the years of training that had shaped every muscle in my body long before I ever set foot on this station. I crossed the room faster than human eyes were supposed to track, closing the distance to the nearest mercenary before he could fully adjust his aim, disarming him with a controlled motion honed through countless hours of drills I had promised myself I would never need again. The second mercenary hesitated for half a second, startled by what he had just witnessed, and that half second was all the time Ren needed to end the threat. The room went quiet, except for Leora's controlled breathing and the distant sound of alarms still echoing through the station. She stared at me across the small space, her eyes wide, taking in what she had just seen with the same sharp focus she brought to everything. I had stopped pretending to be slow. I had stopped pretending to be ordinary. Whatever careful mask I had built over the past month lay in pieces on the floor, along with the mercenary's disabled weapon. "There is no time for this conversation," I said, my voice steady, despite the storm of thoughts behind it. "We need to move, now." To her credit, she did not argue, did not demand answers in the middle of a crisis, though I could see the questions burning behind her eyes. She followed me without hesitation as I led her and Ren through a maintenance corridor I remembered from a station schematic I had studied months earlier out of old habit, the kind of habit that never quite goes away, no matter how ordinary a life you try to build on top of it. We moved through narrow service passages, avoiding the main corridors where more mercenaries were likely converging, and twice I felt the telltale vibration of heavy footsteps moving in parallel paths, hunting for us with the kind of coordinated precision that told me this was not a group of opportunistic raiders. This was a planned extraction, or a planned assassination, and either possibility meant Leora's life had a much shorter clock on it than any of us wanted to admit. "How do you know these corridors so well?" Leora asked quietly as we moved, her voice barely above a whisper. "Habit," I said. "I like knowing where the exits are." "That is not an answer. It's the only one I have time to give you right now." We reached a small control room tucked behind the station's secondary power relay, a space few people even knew existed, and I sealed the door behind us, using an override code I should not have known, one more small crack in the mask I no longer had any hope of repairing. Ren Dax watched me work the panel with narrowed, calculating eyes, clearly cataloging every strange, impossible skill I displayed, filing them away for a conversation I knew was coming, whether I wanted it or not. "This will hold them for a while," I said, stepping back from the sealed door. "Long enough to get a message out and figure out our next move." Leora sank into one of the small chairs against the wall, some of her composure finally cracking under the weight of the last 20 minutes. "People tried to kill me tonight," she said quietly. "In a place that was supposed to be neutral, supposed to be safe. Neutral ground only stays neutral as long as it benefits the people standing on it," I said. "Someone decided it no longer benefited them." "Draven," she said again, more certain this time. "We'll find out," I said, "but right now, staying alive matters more than being right." She looked up at me then, and something in her gaze had changed completely from the curious, careful questioning of the past month. This was not idle curiosity anymore. This was the look of someone who had just watched a stranger move through danger like it was a second language, who had just been pulled from death by hands too fast and too certain to belong to an ordinary man, and who now understood, with complete clarity, that the person she had chosen almost at random weeks earlier was not who he had ever claimed to be. "Whatever you are," she said quietly, "thank you for being it tonight." I did not have an answer for that either, not one I trusted myself to say out loud, without everything else spilling out along with it, so I simply nodded and turned back toward the door, listening for the sound of footsteps in the corridor beyond, knowing that whatever explanation I owed her would have to wait until we survived the night. Ren Dax, still watching me with open suspicion, finally broke the silence. "You are no maintenance technician," he said. It was not a question. "No," I admitted, the word feeling strange and heavy, after 6 years of denying it to everyone, including myself. I'm not. Outside the sealed door, the footsteps grew closer, and somewhere beyond the smoke-filled corridors of Arella's station, the true shape of the night's danger was only beginning to reveal itself. Whoever Draven had hired was not simply looking to kill a princess in the chaos of a staged attack. They were looking for something far more specific, something that would not become clear to any of us until the fighting had ended and the deeper truth of that night finally came into the light. The attack lasted almost 2 hours before station security, reinforced by a Kaelan warship that arrived in response to Leora's emergency beacon, finally drove the remaining mercenaries off the station or captured them in the lower corridors. By the time the all-clear signal sounded, the sun cycle lamps had already begun their slow simulated dawn, casting pale light across a station that looked nothing like the peaceful diplomatic post it had been the morning before. Scorch marks streaked the walls near the breach points. Emergency crews moved through the halls, carrying the injured toward the medical bay, and the air still carried the faint, bitter smell of burned metal and spent weapons fire. I stayed close to Leora through all of it, even after the immediate danger passed, some old instinct refusing to let me relax my guard until I was certain the threat had truly ended. She noticed, of course. She noticed everything. "You have not left my side in 6 hours," she said quietly, as we finally sat together in a quiet corner of the medical bay, while a Kaelan physician tended to a shallow cut on Ren's shoulder. "Old habits," I said. "Habits from what, exactly?" she asked, and this time there was no sharpness in her voice, only tired, honest curiosity. "I think I have earned an answer by now, Ethan. I watched you disarm 2 trained mercenaries with your bare hands. I watched you navigate corridors you should have no reason to know. I watched you seal a door with an override code that should not exist outside of a very small, very specific list of authorized personnel." I looked at her for a long moment, weighing everything I had promised myself I would never say out loud again. But something about the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her hands still trembled faintly from adrenaline even now, made the old careful silence feel suddenly cruel rather than wise. "Not tonight," I said finally. "You need rest, and this deserves more than a rushed explanation in a medical bay. But I promise you, Leora, when the time is right, I will tell you everything." She studied my face for a long moment, searching for the lie she had grown so used to expecting from me, and apparently did not find it, because she simply nodded and let the subject rest, at least for the moment. But Leora Vex was not a woman who waited patiently once her curiosity had been fully awakened, and I should have known that a single promise would not be enough to hold back the tide of questions building behind her calm expression. 3 days later, while I was still helping station engineering repair the damage from the attack, Sarah Nith found me alone in a quiet maintenance corridor and closed the door behind her with a soft, deliberate click. "The princess does not know I am here," Sarah said. "But I think you should know what I have found before she confronts you with it herself." My stomach tightened. "What did you find?" I used channels available to Kaelan intelligence to search deeper into human military archives than the princess's official requests were able to reach, Sarah said. "Most of what exists about you before you arrived at this station is buried under layers of classification that even our systems struggled to penetrate. But buried classification still leaves traces, Ethan Bell. And the traces I found carry a designation I have never seen attached to an ordinary soldier." She held out a small datapad, its screen glowing faintly, with lines of text I recognized immediately, though I had not seen that particular classification marking in 6 years. My chest went tight and cold at the sight of it. "Ashwalker," Sarah read aloud, watching my face carefully as she said it. "Program status listed as terminated. All personnel records sealed under the highest level of human military classification. No further information available through any channel I possess." She lowered the pad slowly. "I do not know what this word means, but I know enough about the shape of secrets to recognize when I have found something far larger than a maintenance technician's forgotten past." I did not answer immediately. I stood in that quiet corridor, staring at a word I had spent 6 years trying to forget existed, feeling the careful, ordinary life I had built around myself finally beginning to collapse under its own weight. "Please," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended, "don't tell her, not like this. Not from a stolen file and second-hand words. If she is going to learn what that word means, she deserves to hear it from me." Sarah studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the way that only someone who has spent a lifetime advising royalty can manage. "You have 3 days," she said finally. "After that, I will tell her myself, because I will not allow my princess to walk beside a stranger she does not fully understand, not after what happened on this station. She trusted you with her life once already. She deserves the chance to decide, with full knowledge, whether she is willing to do so again." She left without waiting for my response, and I stood alone in that corridor for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, listening to the distant hum of the station's repaired systems and thinking about a war that officially never happened, fought by soldiers who officially never existed, against an enemy that humanity had agreed, in the deepest and most secret rooms of its government, never to speak of again. I thought about the promise I had made to myself the day I hung up my uniform for the last time. I thought about the faces of the people I had served beside, people whose names were now etched only on a memorial wall, so deeply classified that even their own families had never been told the truth of how they died. And I thought about Leora, sitting quietly 2 decks away, waiting for an honesty I had spent 6 years training myself never to give. 3 days was not very long. But it was, I realized, exactly the amount of time I needed to finally stop running from a truth that had been chasing me since the moment she first looked at me across that crowded hall and saw something no one else had ever bothered to look for. I asked Leora to meet me alone, in the same garden room where she had first asked me to walk with her weeks earlier, back when her questions still felt like careful curiosity rather than urgent necessity. She arrived without Ren, without Sarah, dressed simply, her expression calm but watchful, the way it always was when she expected something important. "You said you would tell me everything," she said, sitting on the same stone bench where we had first talked. "I am here." I sat across from her, and for a moment I said nothing at all, trying to find the right place to begin a story I had never told anyone outside a small circle of people bound by the same silence. 12 years ago, I said finally, humanity made first contact with a species called the Vorn. You have never heard of them because almost no one outside a very narrow circle of human command has ever been allowed to hear of them. They found one of our earliest deep space colonies, a small settlement on the edge of explored territory, and they did not come to negotiate. Leora's expression did not change, but I saw her lean forward slightly, listening with complete focus. "The Vorn saw us the way most of the galaxy still sees us," I continued. "Primitive, disorganized. Not worth the effort of careful diplomacy. They attacked the colony without warning, and within days they had wiped out nearly everyone living there. Humanity's government made a decision in the aftermath, a decision very few people were ever told about. They decided the rest of the galaxy could never learn that this attack had happened, because a galaxy that saw humans as too weak to protect their own colonies would see us as an easy target for every ambitious power looking to expand." "So you hid it," Leora said quietly. "We hid it," I said, "and we built something to make sure it never happened again without a response. A program, small, secret, made up of volunteers who agreed to undergo modifications that would let us fight the Vorn on something closer to equal footing. Enhanced reflexes, enhanced strength. Training that pushed the human body and mind past what most people would consider survivable. We were never given a public name. Internally, we were called Ashwalkers because we were meant to walk through the wreckage the Vorn left behind and make certain it never happened again. You were one of them," Leora said. It was not a question. "I was," I said. "For 2 years, I fought in a war that officially never occurred, against an enemy the rest of the galaxy has still never heard of, alongside people who accepted that if we died, our own families would never know how or why. We were good at our work, Leora. Good enough that we drove the Vorn out of human space entirely, at a cost I do not like to remember in detail. When the war ended, the program was disbanded. Most of us scattered, given new identities, ordinary postings, and instructions to disappear quietly into the kind of unremarkable lives no one would ever look at twice. Why hide it, even after the war ended? Leora asked. You defeated them. That should have been a mark of strength, not something to bury. Because strength invites attention, I said, and attention, for a species as young and unprotected as humanity, is dangerous. If the galaxy learned that a handful of enhanced human soldiers had driven off an enemy most civilizations consider frightening, we would stop being an ignored footnote and start being a resource. Empires would want to recruit us. Others would want to study us, or worse, replicate whatever was done to make us what we are, without asking whether we would survive the process the way we did. Humanity's leaders decided that being underestimated was safer than being valuable. So they buried the truth, buried the program, and asked the last of us to bury ourselves along with it. Leora was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I had told her with the same careful intelligence she brought to everything else. That is why your file has a gap, she said finally. That is why you notice danger before it happens, why you moved faster than any human should be able to move, why you knew an override code that should not exist. Yes, I said. And when I chose you, she said slowly, at the selection ceremony, when I looked at every human candidate in that hall and felt something pull my attention toward you specifically, was that only chance? I hesitated, because this was the part even I did not fully understand. I don't know, I admitted. I have wondered about that more than anything else since the day you chose me, whether some instinct in you recognized something in me before either of us understood what it was. Sarah believes I chose you because some part of me already sensed the truth beneath your careful mask, Leora said. I did not want to believe her. I told myself I chose you because you looked tired in a way none of the other candidates did, as if you carried something heavier than the rest of them. Perhaps we were both right. We sat together in silence for a while after that, the quiet stretching between us, filled with everything that had finally been said and everything that still remained unspoken. I watched her carefully, waiting for the fear I had always expected to see whenever the truth finally surfaced, the recoiling that came from realizing you had trusted a stranger who was capable of far more violence than you had understood, but that fear never came. Instead, she reached out and placed her hand over mine, her grip steady and certain. You could have told me nothing, she said. You could have let me believe the mask was real. Many men would have chosen that path, especially after tonight, when the truth might have cost you whatever trust remained between us. I almost did, I admitted. For 6 years, hiding was the only thing that kept me and everyone connected to that program safe. It is a very hard habit to break. But you broke it, she said. For me. For you, I agreed, and the words felt lighter leaving my mouth than any truth I had spoken in years. She studied me for a long moment, then asked the question I had been quietly dreading since the moment I decided to tell her everything. Draven will not stop with one failed attack, she said. He hired mercenaries once already, and he will not accept failure easily. If war comes to this station again, and I believe it will you fight for me the way you fought for your own colony, all those years ago? I met her eyes without hesitation, feeling something settle inside me that had been unsettled since the moment I first stepped off that final transport ship and tried to become an ordinary man. I never stopped being what I am, I said. I only stopped letting anyone see it. If Draven brings war to this station again, he will finally understand exactly what humanity has been hiding all along. Leora's hand tightened slightly around mine, and for the first time since the attack, I saw something in her expression that was not fear, not caution, not even simple curiosity. It was resolve, matched perfectly against my own. Two people who had each spent their lives carrying weight they were not permitted to set down in front of others, finally choosing to carry it together instead. Before she left the garden that evening, Leora asked one more question, quieter than the rest, one that reached somewhere deeper than curiosity about files and classifications. "Was it worth it?" she asked. "Everything you gave up, everyone you lost, the 2 years that turned you into what you are now, and the 6 years you spent trying to hide it afterward." I thought about that question longer than any of the others, because it deserved more than a quick, practiced answer. I thought about the faces of the people I had served beside, soldiers who had volunteered for the same modifications I had, who had trained beside me through months that tested every limit the human body was believed to have. Some of them had not survived the war. A few had not survived the process that made us what we were in the first place. I still carried their names quietly, in the private, unspoken part of myself that no file or classification would ever record. I used to ask myself that question every single night after the program ended, I said. For a long time, I did not have an answer, only grief and guilt for surviving when so many others did not. But sitting here, telling you the truth after 6 years of silence, watching you accept it instead of turning away from it, I think I finally understand the answer. I looked at her steadily. It was worth it, because it meant this station is still standing, and you are still sitting across from me, instead of becoming another name on a memorial nobody outside a classified file will ever read. Leora reached out and touched my face gently, her fingers cool against my skin. "Then let their sacrifice mean something more than silence," she said. "Let it mean this instead, a future built on truth, rather than a past buried under it." I did not have words for how deeply that simple sentence settled into me, so I said nothing at all, only reached up and held her hand against my face for a long moment, letting the quiet garden room hold both of us in a silence that finally felt like peace instead of secrecy. Neither of us knew, in that quiet garden room, exactly how soon Draven's next move would come, or how completely it would force the truth of what I was into the open for the entire Dominion to witness. But sitting there, with her hand in mine, I found that for the first time in 6 years, I was no longer afraid of what the world might see if the mask finally fell away completely. Word of the truth did not stay contained to the garden room for long. Leora insisted on telling Ren and Sarah herself, choosing honesty over secrecy now that the choice was finally hers to make, and I stood beside her while she did it, ready to answer whatever questions followed. Ren took the news the way I expected a career soldier to take it, with narrowed eyes and a long list of practical questions about my capabilities, my limits, and whether I could be trusted to fight alongside Kalen guards without causing confusion in the middle of a battle. I answered every question honestly, and by the end of the conversation, something in his stiff posture had eased, just slightly, the wary suspicion replaced by something closer to professional respect. "I have fought beside many soldiers from many species," Ren said finally. "I did not expect to add a human to that list. But I have seen what you can do, Ethan Bell, and I would rather have you beside me than against me." Sarah's reaction was quieter, more thoughtful. She studied me for a long moment after Leora finished explaining, then nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. "I searched for your secret because I feared it might endanger the princess," she said. "I did not expect to find a man who has already given so much to protect people who were never permitted to thank him for it. That changes how I see this, Ethan. It changes it considerably." That evening, station security intercepted a coded transmission originating from a ship registered under one of Draven's known associates, moving through a trade route just beyond the station's border. The message itself was encrypted, but the pattern of the transmission, the destination it was aimed at, and the timing following so closely after the failed attack told Colonel Whitfield everything she needed to know. "He's building a larger force, Grace said, standing in the station's command center with Leora, Ren, Sarah, and me gathered around the display. The mercenaries he hired for the first attack were meant to be quiet and quick. This time, based on the size of the fleet movement we're tracking, he's not planning anything quiet. "How long do we have?" Leora asked. 2 days, Grace said. "Maybe 3, if we're fortunate." Leora turned to look at me, and I saw the same resolve in her eyes that had settled there in the garden room hours earlier. "Then we use the time we have," she said. "Ethan, you know things about defending a position under attack that none of us have had reason to learn. I want your help preparing this station, and I want it without hesitation." I felt the old, familiar shift happen inside me, the transition from ordinary man to something else entirely, a transition I had spent 6 years refusing to allow myself. This time, I did not fight it. "Then let's get to work," I said, "because if Draven wants to bring a war to this station, he is going to find out exactly what kind of war he has chosen to start." For 2 days, Aurella's station transformed from a quiet diplomatic post into something closer to a fortress. I worked alongside Colonel Whitfield's engineering teams, reinforcing weak points in the station's defenses that I recognized immediately from years of studying enemy assault patterns that translated more easily than I expected from one kind of war to another. I helped Ren train the Kalan Guard in coordinated defense formations designed to hold narrow corridors against a larger force, techniques drawn from tactics my old commanders had drilled into me during the darkest months of the Vorn conflict. Leora insisted on being present for every planning session, absorbing details with the same sharp focus she brought to everything, refusing to be treated as someone who needed to be protected from the reality of what was coming. "I will not hide in a shelter while others fight for my life," she told Grace, when the colonel gently suggested she remain in a secured location during the coming battle. "I have already lost that argument once, in a corridor with a beam falling toward my head. I do not intend to lose it again." Grace glanced at me, and I only shrugged. "She's not wrong," I said. "And honestly, I'd rather have her where I can see her than trust that any shelter on this station is truly safe from Draven's reach." By the 3rd day, our preparations were as complete as they were ever going to be, and the ships arrived exactly when Colonel Whitfield's projections had warned they would. Draven's fleet dropped out of transit space in a tight, disciplined formation, far larger than the scattered mercenary raid from days earlier. These were not opportunistic hired guns. These were trained soldiers, wearing the unmarked but unmistakably professional armor of a private military force built with serious resources behind it. Draven had spent every credit and every favor he possessed to make certain this attempt would not fail the way the first one had. "All hands to defense positions," Grace's voice rang out through the station comm. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." I stood beside Leora in the station's central corridor, the last line of defense between the breach points and the command center where the most vulnerable members of both delegations had gathered. Ren stood on her other side, weapon steady, and Sarah coordinated communication between our scattered defense teams from a secure terminal nearby. My heart beat with a steady, familiar rhythm, the same calm focus I remembered from the worst nights of the Vorn War. A strange kind of peace that only ever seemed to settle over me in the moments before violence. "Are you afraid?" Leora asked quietly, watching my face in the dim emergency lighting. "No," I said honestly. "This is the one part of my old life I never had to pretend about. I know exactly what I'm capable of here." The first wave of Draven's soldiers breached the outer hull 12 minutes later, and the corridor filled with the harsh sounds of battle, shouted commands, and the sharp crack of weapons fire echoing off metal walls. I moved through those corridors the way I had trained to move years earlier, not recklessly, but with complete precision, disabling threats before they could fully register my presence, protecting the defense lines Ren and Grace had carefully constructed, buying time for station reinforcements to organize a stronger response. Word spread quickly among the attacking soldiers that something was different about this defense, that the human moving through their ranks was not behaving like any ordinary technician or diplomat, and I watched their coordinated formations begin to falter as they adjusted, too late, to a threat their intelligence briefings had never prepared them for. Draven himself arrived nearly an hour into the assault, flanked by a small personal guard, moving through a secondary corridor toward the command center with clear intent. I met him there, blocking the narrow passage, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something other than cold confidence in his expression. "You," he said, staring at me with open disbelief, "the maintenance technician. I was told you were nothing, a curiosity my cousin chose on a whim." "Your intelligence was wrong," I said. "It happens. When you underestimate people, you've never bothered to understand." Draven's guards moved to attack, and I met them with the same precision I had used throughout the corridors behind me, disabling each threat carefully, without unnecessary harm, until only Draven himself remained standing in that quiet, tense corridor. "This does not need to end in more bloodshed," I said. "Call off your remaining forces, surrender, and the Dominion's courts can decide your fate through proper channels rather than through a battle you have already lost." Draven's composure finally cracked, the elegant confidence replaced by something closer to desperation. "She was always meant to be mine," he said. "The succession, the alliance with your pathetic species, all of it was meant to strengthen my position, not hers. I will not lose everything to a woman who chose a nobody, over-calculated strategy." "She didn't choose a nobody," I said quietly. "She chose someone honest enough to protect what matters, instead of someone ambitious enough to destroy it for personal gain. That's the difference between you and me, Draven. And it's the reason this ends, with you standing alone in a corridor, out of soldiers, out of options, and completely out of time." Reinforcements from Grace's security teams arrived moments later, moving to secure Draven before he could attempt anything further, and the remaining scattered forces, still fighting through the station's corridors, began surrendering once word spread that their employer had been captured. Within another hour, the battle for Aurella's station was over. The last of Draven's soldiers either subdued or fled back toward their transport ships, leaving behind a station scarred but standing, and a truth that could no longer be hidden from anyone who had witnessed the fighting. I found Leora in the command center afterward, standing near the main display with Grace and Sarah, coordinating the final details of securing the station and processing Draven's capture. She turned when I entered and crossed the room without hesitation, closing the distance between us in a way that told me every careful formality between us had finally, completely dissolved. "You saved this station," she said. "You saved my life twice now, and you did it while the entire truth of what you are stood fully exposed for the first time in 6 years." "I told you," I said. "I never stopped being what I am. I only stopped letting people see it. That's not something I can do anymore, not after tonight." "Good," she said, "because I do not want the careful, hidden version of you. I chose you at that ceremony, before I understood any of this, drawn to something I could not explain at the time. Now that I do understand it, my answer has not changed. If anything, it has only grown stronger." News of the battle spread quickly beyond Aurella's station, through Dominion channels, and eventually through wider galactic networks that had spent generations treating humanity as an afterthought. The details of exactly what I was, what the Ashwalker program had been, remained carefully controlled, released only in the careful, measured pieces that human command determined necessary to explain the battle without exposing everything that had been protected for 6 years. But even the smallest revealed piece was enough to shift how the wider galaxy looked at humanity from that day forward. A species once dismissed as primitive and unthreatening had proven, in the space of a single battle, that its quiet reputation had never told the whole story. Colonel Whitfield received new orders within weeks, instructions to begin cautiously easing certain classifications. to allow humanity's allies a clearer, if still carefully managed, understanding of what the species was truly capable of when pushed to defend what mattered most. It was not a full unveiling. Some truths, I understood now, would always require careful handling, protected not out of shame, but out of wisdom earned through hard experience. But it was a beginning, a small, deliberate step away from the shadows humanity had hidden in for over a decade. As for Draven, the Dominion's courts moved swiftly once the evidence of his actions became clear, and Leora's position within the succession, once quietly undermined by his ambitions, grew stronger in the aftermath of a crisis she had survived with clear strength and clear judgment. She did not need a rescuer to secure her future. She had already secured it herself, through the same sharp intelligence and quiet resolve that had first drawn her attention to me across a crowded hall weeks earlier. Months later, standing again in that same garden room where I had first told her the truth, I found myself thinking about the careful, ordinary life I had built for 6 years, the walls I had constructed, brick by brick, to keep the world from seeing what I truly was. Leora sat beside me, watching the small stream of water move through its familiar channel, and I realized, with a kind of quiet certainty I had not expected to feel again, that I did not miss those walls at all. "Do you regret it?" she asked, glancing sideways at me, being seen after hiding for so long. "No," I said, and meant it completely. I spent 6 years convinced that being ordinary was the only way to stay safe, the only way to honor the people I lost during the war no one was allowed to remember. But hiding never truly protected anyone. It only delayed the moment when the truth would finally matter. I looked at her, at the steady certainty in her eyes, the same certainty that had first startled me across that crowded hall. "You saw through the mask before I even understood I was still wearing one. I think that might be the most honest thing anyone has done for me in a very long time." Leora reached for my hand, the same way she had in that garden weeks earlier, when the truth had first passed between us. "Then let us build something honest together," she said. "Whatever comes next for your species, and for the Dominion, and for us." Outside the garden room, Aurella's station continued its slow recovery, its scarred corridors gradually repaired, its quiet reputation as a neutral meeting ground gradually restored, though everyone who had witnessed that night's battle would carry the memory of it for the rest of their lives. Humanity's careful, deliberate mask had cracked, not shattered completely, but cracked enough to let a sliver of truth into a galaxy that had spent generations underestimating a species it never truly understood. And somewhere in that quiet garden, sitting beside a woman who had chosen him not for what he pretended to be, but for who he had proven himself to be, when everything was finally laid bare, Ethan Bell allowed himself, for the first time in 6 years, to simply exist without a mask at all. Daniel Ford found me a week later, in the same corridor near my old quarters where he had once brought me stolen coffee and quiet, undemanding company. He looked at me for a long moment, taking in the small but unmistakable differences in how I carried myself now, no longer bothering to hide the steadiness in my hands or the sharpness in my attention. "So it's true," he said. "All of it. The stories going around the station. Most of it," I said. "The parts that are cleared for people to know, anyway." Daniel let out a low breath, shaking his head slowly, though there was no anger in his expression, only surprise settling gradually into understanding. 6 years, Ethan. 6 years of late shifts fixing broken conduits together, and you never said a word. "I couldn't," I said. "I'm sorry for that." "I'm not asking for an apology," Daniel said. "I'm just trying to figure out how I feel about learning my closest friend on this station used to fight in a secret war I was never allowed to know existed." He studied me a moment longer, then, unexpectedly, smiled. "For what it's worth, it explains a lot, like why you always seem to know exactly where the nearest exit was, even in rooms you'd never been in before." "Old habits," I said, and this time, for the first time, The words did not feel like a lie meant to hide something. They simply felt true. We stood there together for a while, easy silence settling between us the way it always had, and I realized that the friendship we had built over 6 ordinary years had not been erased by the truth finally surfacing. If anything, it felt sturdier now, built on something real instead of a mask I no longer needed to maintain. In the months that followed, Aurelis Station slowly returned to its role as a quiet meeting ground between distant civilizations, though its reputation had shifted in ways that would ripple outward for years to come. Word of the battle, carefully filtered through official channels, reached governments and courts across a dozen different systems, and humanity, once dismissed as an unremarkable, primitive species barely worth studying, found itself the subject of careful new attention from powers who had never bothered to look closely before. Colonel Whitfield was reassigned to lead a newly formed liaison office, tasked with managing humanity's gradually shifting relationship with the wider galaxy now that a sliver of its hidden strength had become impossible to fully deny. She asked me, before I left Aurelis Station for the final time, whether I intended to return to that kind of work, to step back into a uniform and a title after so many years spent hiding from both. Not exactly, I told her, but I don't think I can go back to hiding either. I think there's a place for whatever comes after both of those choices. Leora and I remained together after the exchange officially ended, our roles shifting from liaison and princess into something neither of us had a tidy title for yet, something built slowly and carefully out of honesty rather than convenience. The Kalan Dominion's court, initially uncertain how to regard a human once thought to be an unremarkable maintenance worker, gradually came to understand exactly what Leora had recognized in me long before the rest of the galaxy caught up to the truth. Rendax, once coldly dismissive, became something closer to a trusted colleague, the two of us occasionally training together in the quiet hours before the station's simulated dawn, comparing techniques drawn from 2 very different worlds that had turned out to share more in common than either of us expected. On the anniversary of the attack, Leora and I returned to the garden room one final time before departing for a new posting together, one that would take us both further into the galaxy than either of us had ever traveled before. She sat on the same stone bench where she had first asked me simple, careful questions about my life, and I sat across from her, watching the same small stream of water move through its familiar channel. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "what would have happened if I had chosen someone else that day? If my instincts had pulled me toward one of the other candidates instead of you?" "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I think about it less than you might expect. Whatever pulled your attention toward me that day, whether it was instinct, chance, or something neither of us can fully explain, it led us here. I've stopped questioning outcomes that turned out this well." Leora smiled, the same small, genuine smile I had first seen weeks into our time together, back when I still believed I could keep the truth of myself carefully hidden behind polite, careful answers. "I chose you because something about you felt honest, even beneath all that careful hiding," she said. "I did not yet know what you really were, but I knew, somehow, that whatever it was, it mattered. I am glad I trusted that instinct." "So am I," I said, and meant it completely, in a way I had not been able to mean very much of anything during the 6 long years I had spent trying to disappear into an ordinary, unremarkable life. Outside the garden, the station hummed quietly around us, scarred but standing, carrying forward the memory of a night when a hidden truth finally stepped into the light, and a galaxy that had underestimated an entire species for generations found itself forced, at last, to look a little closer. And within that garden, sitting across from a woman who had chosen him not for what he pretended to be, but for exactly who he had proven himself to be when everything was finally laid bare, Ethan Bell understood, with complete and quiet certainty, that he had finally stopped running from himself and had found, instead, someone worth standing still for.